Coade Stone, said to be the product of an entrepreneurial businesswoman by the name of Eleanor Coade. The material itself was renowned for its ability to replicate intricate details, its exceptional resistance to weathering, making it ideal for architectural decorations, statues, and garden ornaments. We're going to read a short history on Coade Stone today, yet another artificial stone-like material, said to have been invented by Eleanor Coade herself, yet in the last publication we read, this business and potential recipes were transferred over from Daniel Pincott to Eleanor Coade in 1769. Now, that detail being speculative and unknown, at least to me. Regardless, we begin to see overlap in these different styles of manufactured stone, along with their respective creators. What seems to be the case is that this technique and industry is heavily guarded and cutthroat. These recipes were not merely given out, most likely why the art of manufactured stone rises and falls, ascending with their creators, and then fades into history with their death. Is it possible that the manufacture of stone in the past is somewhat equivalent to the technological race of nations in our time? Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, robots, and the manufacture of parts for all of the above. Same race, different technology. Merely thoughts to consider, and, as always, that's for you to decide. So, we read. A short history of Coade Stone. Early in the 18th century, attempts were made in England to manufacture an artificial stone which could be used successfully for building purposes, and in 1730 Richard Holt published a short treatise on the subject, which he dedicated to Earl of Burlington, dated from the artificial stone warehouse over against York Buildings Stairs, and near Cooper's Bridge, Lambeth, Surrey. How far this venture was successful cannot now be determined, but it is assumed that the works were carried on until somewhere about 1769, when Mrs. Coade either acquired them or started on an adjoining site her more famous and lasting manufactory. Although Mrs. Coade was fortunate or foreseeing enough to enlist the services of the best artists of her time in designing and directing her manufacture, it was with purely utilitarian ideas she started her work. She did not call it terracotta, though the most suitable Dorset clays were used in its composition, but advertised it as an artificial stone, not cheaper than the real thing, but as a substitute which would withstand the effects of fire and frost, and she was lucky enough, early in her career, to produce irresistible evidence of the truth of her claim, to the satisfaction of the many architects by whom she was eventually employed. Of these, perhaps the most convincing is the work lining the Brentford Road at Syon Park, Isleworth, where the effects of a century and a half of weather on stone and two sorts of terracotta can still be seen. About 1775, Robert Adam erected what Gwilt terms the disgraceful gateway at Syon, all the ornamental features of which are in terracotta, made by some imitator of Coade's artificial stone, which was badly fired and as twisted and in many places, like the real stone and the ashlar of the walling, has almost perished. On the opposite side of the road stand, some vases were made by Mrs. Coade, and, save the one that was damaged a few years ago by the fall of a tree, these are as sharp and perfect today as when they were first made. Notwithstanding that much has been written, in a fragmentary way, about Coade Stone, the personality of its manufacturer has escaped identification. The name does not occur in the Dictionary of National Biography, and we can only gather from correspondence, as for instance the letters of Sir William Chambers, that she was known as Mrs. Coade, although that, as a form of address, at that period, may not necessarily have implied that she was married. Her ware was stamped with the name of Coade, and her accounts were made out in the name of E. Coade, which initial Wyatt Papworth considered stood for Elizabeth. As the manufacture went on for some 50 years after its first establishment, it is not unlikely that more than one generation of the family owned it, and the probabilities seem to be that it was started by Mrs. Coade, a native of Lyme Regis. Mr. Coade is quite mythical, and continued by a daughter, who was joined by a cousin named Seeley, by whom the business was carried on, until the latter's death in 1811, under the style of Coade and Seeley. The site of the factory, which seems to have been started about 1769, was near the King's Arms Stairs, Narrow Wall, Lambeth, to be found now a little south of the Charing Cross Railway Bridge, between Belvedere Road and the river. Here also were the only showrooms when the first catalogue of the ware was issued in 1784, but finding the place too inaccessible for her patrons and for a proper exhibition of her work, Mrs. Coade opened a new building as a permanent gallery at the corner of the Westminster Bridge Road and Narrow Wall, and until recently the short row of houses stretching from there to York Road bore on them a terracotta tablet inscribed Coade Row, 1797. The building of this gallery remained until a few years ago, and when it was pulled down to make room for the existing shops, it retained in its mantelpieces and other decorative features traces of its original use. The entrance to the gallery from the street, constructed entirely in terracotta, was designed by John Bacon, and an engraving of it reproduced on the next page forms the frontispiece of volume 41 of the European magazine. From the catalogue of the contents of her gallery issued by Mrs. Coade in 1799, we are able to determine somewhat the extent of her patronage and the high appreciation her work had received throughout the world during the 30 years which had elapsed since she introduced it. A long list is given of the places to which the ware had been sent, not only in the 3 kingdoms, but on the continent and in America. But, unfortunately, she generally omits the names of the architects and sculptors engaged, and but rarely particularizes the buildings for which the work was prepared. It thus becomes difficult to trace a large proportion of her work, and as it is, when weathered by long exposure, not easy to distinguish from ordinary stone. It generally passes as such when nothing is known to the contrary. Mrs. Coade was fortunate in securing the patronage of Horace Walpole in the very year she commenced her manufacture, as it became the means of introducing her to James Essex and Sir William Chambers, and an account of the work she then executed is of particular interest, not only for this circumstance, but because it still remains at Strawberry Hill as an evidence of the durability of the material, although it was damaged by removal and rebuilding some years ago. The work consisted of 2 gate piers about 2 feet square and 12 feet high, for which Walpole made rough sketches from portions of the tomb of Bishop William de Luda in Ely Cathedral, from which James Essex prepared the working drawings. The result, so far as the work was concerned, was satisfactory, for Walpole writes to Sir Horace Mann on June 8, 1771, "I have made a Gothic gateway to the garden, the piers of which are of artificial stone and very respectable." The bill for the work, however, astonished him, and he referred it to Sir William Chambers to decide what amount ought to be paid. Chambers visited the factory at Lambeth accordingly in June 1772, and went carefully through all the items of the account, which amounted to £175 and 12 cents, I'm assuming, and examined the books, models, casts, and molds, which last he pronounced to be very formidable things, and finally certified that the out-of-pocket expenses of manufacture amounted to £151 and 14 cents. What Walpole eventually paid, we do not know. But so desirous was Mrs. Coade of retaining her patronage that she told Chambers she would rather accept £100 for the work than incur his displeasure. This introduction led to the employment by Chambers, in many of his works, of this artificial stone, as at Somerset House, where the 29 vases which surmount the parapets, the designs for which are in the Soane Museum, were supplied by Mrs. Coade at a cost of 6 guineas each. She also made a number of beautiful vases, and other ornamental features, now in the grounds of Marino, near Dublin, the villa which Chambers erected for the Earl of Charlemont. James Wyatt also employed the material, and his introduction to it may be due to seeing the font, if he were not himself actually the designer of it, which he placed in Milton Abbey, Dorset, in 1791. This font, 4 feet 10 inches high, is octagonal on plan, with 8 figures set in niches around the pedestal, adapted from Sir Joshua Reynolds' window at Oxford. It, or a model of it, was sent to the Royal Academy for exhibition, but was rejected. But the European Magazine of January 1789 says at the King's desire it was sent to Buckingham House, where it remained for some weeks for the inspection of the curious, with the result that a copy of it was made for and set up in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, another one in Debden Church, Essex, and a third in Milton Abbey, as already mentioned. Of these 3, Debden remains in use. Milton disappeared about the time Scott restored the abbey, and that of Windsor was buried within the chapel when the new font by Pearson took its place. The installation of this font at Windsor, which was probably due to the intervention of George III himself, led to the introduction of the artificial stone to the notice of Henry Emelin, who was then in charge of the works at St. George's Chapel. He there employed it for the 3 figures of the patron saints, which still remain on the face of the west gable and some armorial bearings on the cornice of the parapet, removed when it was rebuilt a few years ago, though they were then in a perfect condition. But the most important work of all was the great screen supporting the organ. This stretches across the west end of the choir in 5 bays of fan tracery vaulting, the main shafts having cores of wrought iron 2 inches square inserted to take the weight of the organ, and were it not for the inscription Coade, London, 1789, imprinted at each end of the screen, it might be, and in fact generally is, taken to be an exceptionally well-preserved piece of ancient stonework. There is also in the neighborhood in the church of Langley Marish, across the Kenderminster Chapel, another screen in Coade Stone, vaulted in 3 bays, which may also be from a design by Emelin. During the time Mrs. Coade was executing these works for architects, she was producing a large quantity of speculative work, examples of which were exhibited in her gallery, or preserved in a book of engraved designs, mostly published before 1779. These designs include statues, vases, bas-reliefs, capitals, and various architectural ornaments, many of which were copied from the antique, such as the Townley marbles, or modeled for her by the leading sculptors of the day, among whom were Bacon, Banks, and Rossi. And though Flaxman is said to have been one of these, he may have done little more than make friendly suggestions and introduce some of those who had worked with him in Rome on Wedgwood's designs, chief of whom was de Vere. Among the works which were thus produced were the Cartides from Stuart's Athens, used by Sir John Soane at the Bank of England, the Farnese and Borghese vases, which stand on the garden terrace of Buckingham Palace, and a copy of the Fontana del Tritone, Rome. John Bacon, who was apprenticed to Crisp, the manufacturer of Bow China, when he was out of his articles, seems to have joined himself to Mrs. Coade's factory, and he continued to be associated with it, more or less, until his death, acting as sort of an art superintendent to her works. In the introduction to her catalogue of 1799, she refers to this connection with some pride. Thus, with no disparagement of others, many acknowledgments are due to the genius and exertions of the late Mr. Bacon in the early years of its establishment, whose models now form a considerable part of the collection. As the name of the maker and not of the sculptor appears on the ware, we are unable to identify much of Bacon's work, but we know that he modeled the figures of faith, hope, charity, and meekness, which stand in the vestibule of Greenwich Hospital Chapel, while the great group of figures supposed to represent the apotheosis of Nelson, which faces into the quadrangle of King William's Building, for which Benjamin West supplied the sketch, was modeled by Bacon in conjunction with Panzetta. He also modeled a statue of Contemplation for Dr. Letsom's house in Camberwell Grove, of which a replica occurs in the house at Bromley in which Dr. Philip Norman was born. 2 statues, probably by Bacon, were for many years lying about on some wasteland near Mrs. Coade's gallery, but were rescued by the late Sir Henry Dalton and are preserved at the Lambeth Potteries. On Bacon's death, Jean de Vere seems to have become the art manager of the works, and some of the most beautiful productions of the factory appear to have been modeled by him. De Vere was born at Ghent in 1754, his mother being a descendant of the well-known Flemish painter Van Loo, and he was working in Rome until 1794. Here, Flaxman met him and employed him on work for Wedgwood, for whom he modeled the Achilles and daughters of Lycomedes, and copied antiques which possibly included the bas-reliefs of sarcophagus containing the Barberini vase, which Wedgwood reproduced sometime after 1787. De Vere probably worked for Mrs. Coade as long as her factory endured, for in 1810 he joined a lodge of Freemasons in London, and he died at Tronchenet-le-Gand in 1830. It may be interesting to note in connection with this artist that his great-grandson, M. Gaston de Vere, painted the wall decorations illustrating the art of music in the Donaldson Museum of the Royal College of Music, London, having completed them in 1895. Among the works produced at the factory were a vast number of coat of arms and emblematic groups of figures, still to be found in London and the provinces, not only over shops and offices, but on public buildings, such as the Admiralty and Trinity House, and some of the most beautiful examples of terracotta are to be found among these groups. 2 of them, are able to illustrate one which stood until recently over the Union Assurance Office in Cornhill, and the other still standing over the Pelican Office, absorbed by the Phoenix Company in Lombard Street. Of the former there is some little uncertainty as to the sculptor, the building to which it was attached having been twice pulled down, though it is generally attributed to Rossi. But of the second group we have the full history in a contemporary engraving published in the European magazine. The building of the Pelican Office was designed by Sir Robert Taylor for Sir Charles Askill, and when it was converted into offices in 1797, the present group of 6 figures, shown by the illustration on page 21, was erected. The first sketch for the design is said to have been made by Lady Diana Beauclerk, who also worked for Wedgwood, but the whole was modeled by De Vere, and forms, without exception, the most beautiful group of life-size figures made by Mrs. Coade. There's been some slight departure from the original, or some subsequent alteration, as the early drawings show the hourglass to the right of the group to be standing on a skull. Another very beautiful example of the manufacture was the pair of vases, standing some 5 feet high, belonging to Sir Thomas Dyke, Ackland. One of them is illustrated on page 17 of this issue. They bear the imprint of Coade and Seeley, 1805, so that they belong to the period of De Vere's rule, although they have been attributed to Thorwaldsen. The Bacchic scene depicted was very common on the bas-reliefs, among which De Vere had worked, and the pose and actions of the figures of this vase are identical with them. It may be mentioned that this example was originally bronzed and silvered, but nearly all traces of the metal have disappeared, with the hundreds of years of exposure to the weather. Gilding was occasionally used by Wedgwood on his black basalts and occurs on Dwight's Fulham pottery busts, while Mrs. Coade's great statue of George III at Weymouth was gilt all over. Early in the last century, and within 50 years of its establishment, perhaps though the extinction of the family, the business began to languish, and rivals sprang up in other parts of London. Rossi, who had been one of Mrs. Coade's staff, started for himself and modeled the caryatides and other decorations at St. Pancras Church for Inwood. And later still, Bubb made the great frieze which until recently adorned the facade of the theatre in the Haymarket. Presently the same class of work began to be produced in Roman cement, which was much cheaper, though it depended on paint for its preservation, and the example set by Sir Robert Smirke in using it at the Oxford and Cambridge Club for the bas-reliefs over the first floor windows, modelled by Nicol, was extensively followed, to the ruin of the terracotta manufacture. From the lists published in 1799, we find that during the 30 years which had then elapsed, the output of the factory had been enormous, and in the subsequent 10 or 15 years during which it endured, the quantity may have been equaled. And there must therefore still be, after allowing for almost wanton destruction throughout the country, a large number of Mrs. Coade's works, the origin and material of which are unsuspected and perhaps hidden under coats of paint. Prejudice against them has been often provoked through their descriptive mark, artificial stone, although they are of terracotta, which for excellence of manufacture and power to resist fire and frost can only be compared with the best work of this or any previous period. It was Mrs. Coade's great merit that she had the good sense to employ artists of the highest class to make her designs, and it seems probable that she was more potent than a man could have been in persuading artists to overcome their natural prejudices against a medium that even now is not admitted to full and frank recognition as a vehicle for art. She was therefore a pioneer in the movement, which is now again gathering force, for securing a closer association between artistry and industrialism, for enlarging the artist's horizon and the scope of his activities. Where Bacon, Banks, West, and Flaxman led, the sculptors and designers of today need not hesitate or disdain to follow, nor will they. Nor can it be supposed that the example of Sir William Chambers, and of contemporaries who were almost his compeers, has been lost on architects.